Okay, good evening, and we are live. Glad to join you guys once again tonight, Facebook Live. Give you guys a few moments to log in here, but once again, thankful to have a moment to open the Word of God and share with one another. We were supposed to be having the Singspiration tonight, but we ended up postponing that, putting that off. So this morning, well, I've been tracking the weather, and depending on what app you use, you're going to see different weather reports. And throughout the week, I was seeing differing things. So this morning, I checked weathernetwork.com, checked a few other websites, and according to weathernetwork.com, we're supposed to be having severe thunderstorms in the Moulton area. So I don't know if anyone's closer to Moulton, if that is, but that was a risk we couldn't take having an outdoor Singspiration equipment. Last thing I want is people being struck by lightning while pastor is away. That would not look well and wouldn't be good for us. So we made the decision to put that off. We'll give you guys a later date for that, but once again, we're going to meet here online. So glad that you can join us. And this evening, once again, we're going to be continuing on in the series on Joseph. God meant it unto good. And we're on, I believe this is the fourth message that I've done. So um, we'll continue on here. And this tonight we're going to be in Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41, and we're going to be reading the first 16 verses, and then there's going to be a few verses later on that we will be looking at as well. So if you want to take a moment, get the Genesis chapter 41, and we'll be looking at the first 16 verses here. At this point in Joseph's life, we finally get to a turning point, and from all that he's gone through, we finally see things happening here, and God really starting to lift Joseph up, which he had not been seeing so far in his life. So we'll see a few more of you guys are logged on here. So we're going to go ahead, Genesis chapter 41, and we're going to be reading verses 1 to 16. I'm going to bring that up here. Starting at verse number 1, the Bible says, "And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine, and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, and out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke. And he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee, that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, and saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So here, like I said, we finally get to a turning point in Joseph's life, and Joseph had remained faithful to the Lord throughout all this time, and finally we get to this point where we see Pharaoh's dream. In verse 8, we see his spirit was troubled, Pharaoh's spirit, and he's calling upon people of the land. He's calling on to magicians and so-called wise men to come and try to interpret the dream, and no one could do this. And it's at this point that his chief butler finally remembers Joseph. Joseph had told him in the prison to remember him, and they had forgotten all about him. This jogs the butler's memory, and he finally tells Pharaoh about this man who can interpret the dream. And we see in verse 14 that Joseph is finally released from prison. It says he was hastily brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And we see that he shaved, he put on proper clothing after being in prison so that he would be presentable before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has all confidence in Joseph. He says in verse 15, "Thou canst understand a dream to interpret it." And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace." So Joseph here, he gets an audience before Pharaoh, and he uses this opportunity to give God all the glory, to not take any credit, and to point Pharaoh to God. And he takes this opportunity. So tonight, as we get to this point, not going to be super in depth, but there are things I want you to notice up to this point that were past actions that really determine these defining moments in this turning point of Joseph's life. These moments that Joseph is finally released and he sees God lifting him up. And there's decisions he had to make in the past that determined where he was at this point in his life. And we're going to look at these briefly tonight. So we notice that if when he was in prison, if Joseph had not cared for those in prison, namely the butler and the baker, we know that he cared for them. He saw that they were not well, and he was asking them about their well-being, and he put them before his own needs and his emotions. And if he had not done this, he would not have been released. He would never have met the butler who had told Pharaoh about him, and in turn being released. If Joseph, through all the turmoil that he had gone through, if he had thrown in the towel and given up long ago, he would not be able to have this audience with Pharaoh and show him the true and living God. And we see he does this multiple times. We read it in verse 16. In verse 25 and verse 28, we see that he does this as well. He directs Pharaoh to God and says that he is the one who's doing the work. And Joseph takes this opportunity to point Pharaoh to him. And this wouldn't have happened if Joseph had given up a long time ago and thrown in the towel. He didn't take any credit for himself. Also, we see that while Joseph was in captivity, wherever he was, in Potiphar's house, in prison, he took time to use his skills that God had given him. He had been gifted with a skill of administration. He had been given the gift of interpreting dreams, and he used those skills. He honed those skills during those hard times in his life. And we see that God eventually used those here in this portion of scripture before Pharaoh. And he would not, if Joseph had given up on those skills, just thrown everything to the side, he would not have had the wisdom and skills here to help Pharaoh. So if you have your Bible, if you're to look at verse 33, we see Joseph at this point has already, so we had read the dream already, And then Pharaoh repeats the dream to Joseph, and then Joseph once again interprets the dream for him. So this is all happening. And Joseph has explained the dream about the 7 years of good and the 7 years of famine, and how because the dream was doubled up, that this is going to be happening very soon. And then this is the advice that Joseph gives to Pharaoh because of the wisdom that God had given him. Verse 33, it says, "Now therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the fifth part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants." So he, because of these skills that he had honed in prison, the administrative skills, God had given him wisdom, and he was able to use this and help Pharaoh and ultimately point him to God. And then as well, if Joseph had not continued to trust God, if he decided to take matters into his own hand, God would not have lifted him up at this point. We talked a bit about that in this morning's service, about taking matters into our own hand over trusting God. But we know that Joseph continually trusted God. And even though he knew that God had given him a dream when he was younger about eventually being lifted up, he didn't take matters into his own hand. Rather, he trusted God, waited on him to the point where now God is finally lifting him up at this point. So we'll continue on. Verse 38 here in this passage, it says, "And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. And thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, Bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." So God is finally lifting up Joseph at this point. We see him promoted to second in command over all of Egypt, just below Pharaoh. Not one person was above Joseph other than Pharaoh himself. So Joseph's gone through all this, and God has brought him to this point to use him in a great way. So it was all in God's timing. And so we see these past actions determine all these the very defining moments in this turning point, and we see that it was all in God's timing. As we've been going through the series examining Joseph's life, all the trouble that he's gone through, the trials that we've gone through, and we look at it, and really we read the story and we feel for Joseph. We say, he's gone through so much, he's lost so much, and you feel bad for him. But this is all part of God's plan, as we've studied and learned. And had he not gone through these things, God would not be able to use him in such a time as this before Pharaoh. So had he not been sold into slavery, ultimately in the end, he would not have been able to help his family during the famine, which I'm jumping ahead of myself, but we'll see this in the next message. So had he not been sold into slavery by his own family, he would not be able to help them later on in the future during the famine. So it was all part of God's timing. Had he not been thrown into prison, he would not have come into contact with Pharaoh's chief butler. So we're excited for Joseph. He's working in Potiphar's house. He's promoted. He's over the whole house. He sees the inner workings of it. He's in control of it all. And then we see him lose it all. Once again, he's thrown into a pit. He's thrown into prison. And we feel bad for him. But if that had not happened, Joseph would not have met the Pharaoh's chief butler, who we see later on is the one who reminds Pharaoh about him. So once again, Joseph helps the baker and the butler, and the butler's finally released. And what does the butler do? He does the one thing Joseph asked him to do. He forgets him in prison. But once again, in God's timing, had he not been forgotten in prison and maybe be released early, this would not have happened. I have read that some think that if Joseph had been remembered at that point, because remember, once the butler had left prison and Joseph was forgotten, it was quite a while. So it wasn't like a close time a period of time, but rather it would have been a few years that Joseph was left in prison. But I have read that some people say that if Joseph had been released at that time, if the butler actually had remembered, that it was possible that Joseph would have been released and he would not have been under the bondage of anyone else, and he would have actually been sent back home to his family. And like I said, in God's timing, God allowed Joseph to be second in command and ultimately help his family in the end. Had Joseph been sent home, he would have been in the same position as his family during this time of famine. So the fact that he had been forgotten in prison, once again, is part of God's perfect timing. And we see that the butler at this time, once again, perfect timing, remembered Joseph at the time that Pharaoh needed help. The perfect opportunity for Joseph to get an audience before Pharaoh. So, in God's perfect timing, here's Joseph coming to help Pharaoh, and the great thing about that is that Joseph uses this opportunity to give the glory to God by using his gift for Pharaoh. Once again, his skills, his gifts that God had given him, he's using them to glorify God and to reach Pharaoh and really point him to God, and then to save his own people and the nation of Egypt and surrounding areas. And through this all, Pharaoh recognized Joseph was a man with the Spirit of God. He speaks about this. And we see that Pharaoh placed him second over the land of Egypt. So this all was in God's timing. So finally, at this turning point, we see all these decisions that have been made in the past all have to do with God's timing and all work together. So here's my challenge for tonight. As believers, as we've been going through the life of Joseph and we see all that he's gone through, let me ask you this. What decision should you be making today that God will use in the future? Because sometimes we think about the decisions we make on a daily basis not really affecting our future too much. Just like Joseph, he had these skills, even from when he was young and he was serving his father and just obeying and doing what he was told to do, going that extra mile when he went to look for his brothers when they eventually cast him into the pit. All these things that Joseph, decisions that he made that didn't seem like uh, big decisions, but we see that they affected him in the end. So, what decisions should we be making today that God will use in the future? And we already talked about these. Joseph put others' needs before his own emotions. He cared for the people in prison and he continued to work in prison. And we see that, that's a great character trait of Joseph. We can, in our lives, I think about it, we can so quickly give up on ourselves during trouble. We can give up on other people when we're consumed with our own lives, when maybe God is trying to use us as a channel of blessings to others. Maybe he wants to use us to reach other people, to be a blessing in their lives. And the thing is, when we're in troubling times and we take care of other people and we try to be a blessing to him and we are to them, we allow God to use us as a channel of blessing to others. We are being blessed as well. So maybe in our lives today, we need to be thinking about who is in my life right now that God is trying to use me to impact their life, to point them to Christ, to be a blessing to them. And if we give up on ourselves, we're going to give up on other people as well. So we need to stay focused on God, stay focused on the fact that He's in control, He has a plan for our life, and the decisions that we make today can affect our future. So let's think about that. Uh, let's put other people's needs before our own emotions sometimes, and look to them and give them grace and mercy, just as God has shown that in our life, and help them out. And maybe God is trying to use us, and that will eventually be planting seeds, or maybe watering seeds that we will see bear fruit in the future. And then in Joseph's life as well, we see that, and we kind of talked about this already, he didn't give up and he didn't throw in the towel, but rather, when Pharaoh had pulled him out of prison, Pharaoh could say that this man had the Spirit of God. From all that he's been through, he was still Spirit filled. Can that be said of you? And I'm not even speaking about just going through difficult times. And I know often we talk about Joseph, we talk about going through trials, things like that. I'm just talking about everyday life, our everyday interactions, our everyday responses, in our work ethic every day, just on every aspect of our life. Can that be said of you, that someone could look at you and say, this man has the Spirit of God in his life? Joseph didn't give up, but rather he gave the Lord control over all in his life. And he allowed the Lord to fill him and to control him. So is that true today? Are we allowing God to control our life, to be Spirit filled, to let that impact every area of our life, where people can look at us and say, look, I know that person is a man of God, or that lady is a woman of God, and God is using them, and I can go to them and trust them that they can help me and point me to their God. So in our lives today, we can't give up, but rather we need to make sure that we're living for Him and giving Him total control in our life. And then lastly here, I want you to notice that Joseph used God's given skills in his life, even through difficulties. He worked at them, even in captivity. And ultimately, this is how God was able to use Joseph and his skills to reach Pharaoh. So let me ask you this. Do you have skills that God has given you? And every one of you that's watching tonight can say that God has given me some kind of skill. Are you taking the time to improve those skills, to use them for the glory of God? And often we don't look at our everyday skills as a tool to reach others, but God can use anything in our life to reach others with, and no matter what it is. I talk to people from church all the time who says, yeah, I was on the job site and I was able to witness to this person. Just the fact that they were doing their job well. They took the opportunity, they made sure that they were getting their work done, but they were able to witness to someone on the job. How are you using your skills? Are you able to help people out and to reach them? Use your talents, use your gifts, use the skills that God has given you in your life, work on them, improve those skills, and use them for the glory of God. Use them to reach other people. I've used this illustration before, but when I was younger, there was a point in our life where we weren't attending a church, but my mom was working with a lady, and she was going to Kitchener Baptist Church, and she used the opportunity to say, "Hey, I'm singing at church this Sunday. Why don't you come listen?" And I know she wasn't doing that in a boastful way. She wasn't using that in a way to say, "Hey, look at me, how great I am." But rather, she saw this as an opportunity. Hey, why don't you and why don't I invite you out to come hear me sing as a way to bring us to church? And that was a defining moment, a turning point in our family's lives that brought us back to church. We started attending Kitchener Baptist Church because of that, and God used that in a great way and was speaking to hearts. And I can honestly say, if that lady hadn't used her skills, used that gift that God had given her, stepped out and was trying to glorify God in her own life, uh, God would not have, or sorry, we would not probably have been back in church. But she took that opportunity, and I can thank God for her to be where I am partly today because of that. using the skill that God gave her. So, what skills do you have tonight? What talents has the Lord given you? And are you willing to give it back to Him, to His glory, and allow Him to use you? And we think about the obvious things. We say, "Well, I'm not talented with speaking, or I'm not gifted musically." Those are the kind of the two things that we jump to. But I'm talking about, like, with Joseph, he had administrative skills. He didn't have. We don't see him doing great speeches or things like that. We see him running things orderly, management skills. There are some creative ways we can use our skills and our interests that God has given us to glorify Him and to reach other people. Are you talented with sports? Is that an area in your life that God has gifted you with physical ability? Why not start up a sports clinic at church and invite people out? We've thought about that before with Ideas for the Help program, doing a sports clinic for teenagers. Having some of the skilled people show them different things, training them, but with the idea of having a gospel presentation. We bring people, we use the skills that we have to be a blessing to them and encouragement to them, but then we also not only physically help them, but we're going to be a spiritual help. That's the ultimate goal, to try to reach them with the gospel, and then we'd have a time of devotion. I knew someone in college, or someone I went to college with, who started a basketball ministry, and this ministry was very fruitful. So a lot of the bus kids from the church, they were into sports, and what he started doing was once a week in the evenings, he would rent out a gymnasium at a community center, and he would invite all those kids who were looking for a place to play basketball, and they would have tournaments. They would play basketball, and that thing grew. That ministry grew just from a college student saying, "Hey, I want to reach people. This is an interest that I have. This is a skill I have." And they started seeing a ton of kids going out to that, high school kids, and they would invite their friends. And at every single evening when they would do that, they would have a devotional time where there was a gospel presentation. And it grew into a great big ministry. They ended up having a dunk competition. He would invite guest pastors, but there was always a gospel presentation. He took a talent that he had, a skill that he had, and he used it for God. So I'm not talking about the the skills that we'd always jump to about serving church. I'm talking about everyday skills in our lives, talents, gifts, interests that God has given us that we can use to reach other people. Whatever it may be. I heard a pastor who said, "Hey, maybe you're talented with video games. You and your friends really love video games. Why not have a game night at your house where you invite all your friends, but you don't even have to do the heavy work. You invite the friends over, you get the games ready, and then let's order some pizza, and then after we have pizza, let's have a devotional time. I'll give them a gospel presentation." A simple idea where um, it's not your average thing, but God can still use that. You can still be a witness to people. If you were to come to pastor or myself and you pitched an idea and said, "Hey, I have this idea. I can invite the friends over." I'll tell you right now, pastor myself, we're probably not going to turn down the opportunity to share the gospel with your friends. It would be a great idea. So, what is it? What skill has God given you? What interest has God given you where you can use that to reach people in your life? Maybe you can design things. Maybe you can make videos. Maybe you can knit things. Maybe you can fix things. Maybe you can cook things or bake things or build things. Can you help people? Is that a gift that you have to reach out and help people? Put a band aid on someone? Um, Pastor McLean, not this year obviously, but 2019 with Camp Yes, he told us about a young lady who was impacted by the camp nurse. So this camp nurse, she used to go to Camp Yes, she was a quiet lady, but just being a camp nurse who was there basically to make sure there was no big injuries, maybe put an ice pack on someone, put a band-aid on. But she made an impact in that young lady's life, and she ended up going to nursing school because of that Camp Yes nurse. And she messaged Pastor McLean and said, hey, God blessed me, allowed me to have the skill, and I want to give back to the camp. I want to go serve at camp, just like this lady who had an impact on my life as well. All from having that skill of helping people. What skill is it that you have, and how can you convert that into reaching people? Use that. God had given Joseph a gift in his life, a gift of interpreting dreams. He had given him the skill of administration. He had given him a strong work ethic. And ultimately, he used Joseph and these skills to reach Pharaoh. And we see that he's put in command and to save many lives. He used them. He worked on them. He didn't give up on these skills. And God continued to use Joseph in a great way. And God can use you as well. God can use your skills and your gifts to reach others. So tonight, as we come to this turning point in Joseph's life, and he finally starts to see a glimpse of God fulfilling the dream that he had given him when he was younger, we see that God was going to lift him up and others were going to bow down to him, namely his family, which we'll see in the next message. But we see that the things that God used up to this point, the decisions that he made. So let's be careful as believers that the decisions we're making today are going to be honoring to God, and that God is going to be able to use those in the future. And that the skills that he's given us, the talents that he's given us, we're improving on those. We're honing them. We're using them to glorify God, to honor him, and to reach others through those skills that God has blessed us with. So once again, we're here, Joseph's life, everything's finally starting to look up. God's starting to lift him up. And we're seeing that God meant it unto good, as we read in Genesis 50, verse 20. But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. So I hope this has been a blessing and encouragement to you tonight, once again looking at the life of Joseph. So just a few announcements once again for this week. There's no Bible study this Wednesday, but there will be a missionary update video. I believe it's Brother Brent Marawelli. So we'll be streaming that via Facebook, I believe 6 p.m. on Wednesday. Pastor's Podcast, I mentioned that this morning at church as well. Take advantage of that. Just short podcasts you can listen to in about 10 minutes. Tuesdays and Thursdays, there's a new episode, and you can find those on the church website at legacybaptist.church. And as well if you have an Apple iPhone, you can find those on the podcast app or through iTunes as well. And then Saturday, our Facebook Live devotional in the morning. And then once again, looking forward to another Sunday. Next Sunday, Pastor will be back. And I mentioned this last week, but if you are planning to go to church, if you can sign up earlier in the week, that way you'll be able to reserve a spot. I know last week we were getting pretty filled up, so that's a great help to us to plan to make sure that we aren't overcrowded and that we're following the guidelines. So if you'd sign up throughout the week so that we don't get a ton of people signing up Saturday night and then not having enough room on Sunday morning. So if you do that for us, that'd be a great help. So I trust that you all have a good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will see you next time. So take care and God bless.